As night settled over London on January 30th, 2026, an unexpected announcement from Buckingham Palace quietly broke decades of silence surrounding one of the monarchy's most carefully protected secrets. The statement released to the public appeared short and tightly controlled, but the revelation inside it carried enormous weight. It confirmed that Lady Louise Windsor, the soft-spoken 22-year-old granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth II, had inherited a hidden Scottish estate that most people around the world had never even heard of before. The property carries a name that, until recently, existed almost entirely inside hushed palace conversations: the Grey House. Among royal staff, it was spoken of quietly, almost like a code phrase. A place so private and deliberately shielded that even some senior members of the royal family had never crossed its threshold. Yet what made the palace announcement truly dramatic was not simply the inheritance itself. Behind the scenes, tension had already been building for weeks. According to several insiders, Queen Camilla and members of the Parker Bowles family had been quietly manoeuvring to claim that very estate. Surveyors reportedly reviewed the land. Lawyers examined ownership structures. Strategic conversations took place behind closed doors. Plans were discussed with confidence. And then, suddenly, those plans collapsed. The estate did not pass into the hands many expected. Instead, it landed with Lady Louise, a young woman who rarely seeks public attention and who had never positioned herself as a central figure in royal affairs. What unfolds from this moment becomes more than a story about land or inheritance. It becomes a story about legacy, trust, and the surprising way one quiet granddaughter came to guard some of the late Queen's most personal history. Naturally, curiosity spread almost immediately. People began asking the same question again and again. What exactly is the Grey House? For more than 70 years, this estate existed almost like a shadow within the royal landscape. There were no published photographs, no official tours, and no public registry clearly linking it to the crown. Even within palace systems, it was rarely described openly. Staff who knew about the property referred to it through discreet references, keeping the location and its purpose hidden from unnecessary attention. The estate lies deep within the rugged terrain of the Scottish Highlands, across more than 200 acres of Cairngorm land. The surrounding landscape is remote, windswept, and naturally concealed by hills and forests. Anyone passing through the area would have little reason to suspect a royal sanctuary was hidden there. That invisibility was intentional from the beginning. According to former palace staff, the Grey House served a deeply personal purpose for Queen Elizabeth. It was where she occasionally escaped the constant weight of the crown. Away from ceremony, expectation, and public attention, it allowed her a rare space of privacy. The property was first acquired in 1952, only months after Elizabeth ascended the throne. Even the purchase itself was carefully structured to keep the estate hidden. The official deed did not list a royal title or direct connection to the crown. Instead, it was secured through a private holding company connected to advisors who had previously managed parts of the Queen Mother's Highland inheritance. From the beginning, the intention was clear. The estate was never meant for public attention. Former staff members later recalled that the Queen occasionally retreated to the Grey House for short visits throughout her reign. Even during those private stays, she continued reviewing official government documents through her familiar red dispatch boxes. But everything else slowed down. There were no formal audiences, no photographers, and no long ceremonial schedules. Within those quiet walls, she was not performing the role of sovereign. She was simply Elizabeth. Not everyone appreciated the remote hideaway. Prince Philip reportedly found the estate too cold and isolated for his taste and rarely visited. Princess Anne spent occasional weekends hunting nearby during her younger years, but kept some distance from the house itself. Princess Margaret reportedly visited once and never returned. Perhaps the most surprising detail involves King Charles III. According to several palace sources, Charles never set foot on the property during his entire life. That fact would later become important. Without a personal connection to the estate, Charles had little reason to defend it passionately when questions about its future eventually surfaced. Yet the Grey House holds a deeper mystery than its isolation. What truly sets it apart is what Queen Elizabeth chose to store inside it. Palace insiders say the estate quietly became a repository for some of the Queen's most personal historical materials. These were not the carefully catalogued records found in the official royal archives. Instead, the collection reportedly included handwritten correspondence, photographic negatives, and audio recordings that were never formally registered. Hidden among those materials are believed to be private diaries from the earliest years of her reign, along with letters exchanged with major world figures. Names mentioned by insiders include Dwight D. Eisenhower, Nelson Mandela, and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Perhaps the most touching items are said to be recorded messages the Queen created for her grandchildren. These recordings were not speeches for the public or statements for official history. They were personal reflections from a grandmother whose public voice was almost always formal and restrained. Royal archival rules allow a monarch to place certain materials outside the official state archive through private legal arrangements. Once protected in that way, those items cannot be claimed by the Crown, by Parliament, or even by the next monarch who inherits the throne. Control belongs entirely to the person named in the legal instrument. In this case, that person turned out to be Lady Louise Windsor. So when Buckingham Palace confirmed her inheritance, the announcement meant far more than the transfer of land. It meant Louise had been entrusted with the late Queen's private voice, her reflections, and decades of personal memories. At just 22 years old, Louise suddenly became the guardian of materials that historians, biographers, and even members of the royal family cannot access without her permission. Museums cannot display them unless she allows it. Even future monarchs cannot reclaim them. Many observers naturally began wondering how someone who rarely appears in public reached such a position of trust. The answer appears to lie in a quiet relationship that developed over several summers. Between 2019 and 2021, Lady Louise reportedly spent extended periods at Balmoral with her grandmother, while other relatives came and went. She stayed longer than most, walking with the Queen in the mornings and spending quiet afternoons in private libraries. Former staff members noticed something unusual about those moments. One lady-in-waiting later recalled that Louise never tried to impress anyone or draw attention to herself. She simply listened carefully and allowed silence to exist comfortably between them. Over time, that quiet trust appears to have deepened. In October 2021, only months after Prince Philip's funeral, Queen Elizabeth signed a highly specific legal document designed to protect the Grey House from entering public registry or becoming part of the Crown estate. The document created a conditional legacy arrangement that shielded the estate from outside oversight. It also contained a clause that explicitly excluded Queen Camilla, her children, and their direct descendants from access to the property. Within royal legal circles, the provision reportedly earned a nickname, Clause 31. Only a small group of people knew this clause existed. The Queen's personal solicitor knew, Princess Anne knew, Prince Edward knew, and each of them honoured the Queen's request for silence. Still, curiosity eventually began to grow. According to internal reports, Queen Camilla started asking quiet questions about the estate in late 2024 after a sealed inheritance document from Elizabeth was opened by a private solicitor. Rather than asking directly about the Grey House, she explored whether any royal assets had been excluded from duchy estate records. So, in early January 2026, during a private conversation at Birkhall, the Scottish residence associated with King Charles, Camilla reportedly presented an idea. She suggested the Grey House could be brought under a form of royal stewardship connected to charitable initiatives linked to her foundations. What she did not realise at that moment was that the estate's future had already been legally sealed elsewhere, and that the quiet granddaughter she underestimated had already become the keeper of one of Queen Elizabeth's most personal legacies. From the very moment the proposal reached the palace, It carried an air of quiet sophistication and meticulous calculation, a plan that at first glance seemed merely cultured, but, on closer inspection, revealed ambitions that stretched far beyond the ordinary. She spoke eloquently of restoring historic Highland architecture, yet she deliberately downplayed the more culturally charged portion of her proposal: literary retreats spanning 3/4 of a century, aimed at Britain's most distinguished authors. The plan included conservation projects aligned with rewilding initiatives and a highly selective, invitation-only heritage tourism program, promising experiences far more intimate than the typical public tours. But palace insiders, well versed in reading between the lines of royal communications, quickly realized that the proposal contained far more profound intentions: strategic, personal, and deeply political. Securing control of the Grey House was never simply about adding a picturesque estate to her portfolio. Its location offered proximity to Balmoral, one of the monarchy's most iconic Scottish holdings, and access to the symbolic aura that had shaped generations of the royal family. Control of the property implied influence over historically sensitive archives, rare documents, and artifacts that were rarely handled outside the tightest circle of trust. Perhaps most importantly, it would attach the Parker Bowles name to one of Queen Elizabeth's most private and treasured sanctuaries, a space that symbolized intimacy, legacy, and continuity of the crown itself. She wasn't asking for a cottage, one senior official remarked with understated irony. She was seeking geography, authority, and leverage. This was a calculated move, and nothing less. Weeks before making a formal proposal, Camilla reportedly dispatched surveyors to the region under the guise of conducting environmental evaluations. Architectural consultants had already drafted extensive restoration budgets, and tourism specialists quietly assessed boutique-level heritage programming. Anyone familiar with the nuanced language of palace politics would immediately recognize the unmistakable subtext. This was no casual suggestion. It was a meticulously planned, carefully coordinated campaign, executed with precision, timed to exploit institutional rhythms and gaps in oversight. King Charles, however, refrained from public confrontation. Instead, he employed the more subtle strategy characteristic of centuries of royal governance: deliberate stalling. Meetings were deferred, legal counsel quietly consulted, and the Royal Estate Council was instructed to review ownership structures that had remained untouched since the early 1950s. Then, in a closed session on January 12th, attended only by the King, his private secretary, and 2 constitutional advisers, Charles delivered a measured yet resolute verdict. The estate was not available for reassignment. Not now, not ever. Notice what was never stated. Charles made no reference to his mother's prior instructions, made no mention of Edward's household, and never spoke Lady Louise's name aloud. Instead, he framed the refusal as a matter of pre-existing private settlement, beyond the scope of Crown review or debate. Advisers described the tone as deliberate, calm, and unyielding, a masterclass in controlled authority. Camilla left the meeting outwardly composed, yet insiders report she was visibly shaken, having already anticipated the coming revelation. 3 days later, Buckingham Palace confirmed what Camilla's advisers had feared. The Grey House had been bequeathed outright to Lady Louise Windsor, not to Prince Edward, not to a shared family trust, not to royal administrators, but to Louise alone. The late Queen's private will, sealed in October 2021, granted her youngest Wessex granddaughter full and unrestricted ownership, including all buildings, land titles, archival holdings, and staff contracts. One clause permitted Louise to refuse public access indefinitely. Senior courtiers circulated the stark language: "This house is to remain a refuge, not a monument." For a moment, the implications were staggering. The property bypassed Edward entirely, flowing directly to his daughter, functioning as a dowry-like gift and an unmistakable act of personal affection. To outsiders, it seemed almost controversial, yet those who knew Elizabeth II intimately understood it as deliberate and protective, a choice made to preserve legacy above all else. The announcement landed like an earthquake for the Parker Bowles family. Tom Parker Bowles had been quietly exploring heritage partnerships linked to Highland culinary traditions. Palace tourism advisors had spent months examining zoning regulations near the Grey House. All of that meticulous groundwork evaporated overnight. Shock gave way to disbelief. Disbelief to simmering rage. One family associate remarked that the Queen had drawn a clear and final boundary, and they had been left entirely outside it. Phone calls ricocheted between London and Gloucestershire. Lawyers were consulted and then dismissed. The will was unassailable, and at the centre of the storm stood the truth. Elizabeth II had made her choice. Camilla, after decades of service and loyalty, was suddenly confronted with the fact that she had no power over a legacy she had long hoped to claim. Yet the story's extraordinary dimension lay in Louise herself. For nearly a year she had quietly prepared for this moment, far from public scrutiny. She had been visiting the Grey House in secret since mid-2025, travelling in plain clothing, accompanied by a discreet female protection officer, and remaining for days at a time. Locals were told she was part of a university research team studying geographic history, but in truth, she had been trained by 2 former archivists and a royal legal advisor, learning to catalogue primary sources, manage estate staff, and establish legal claims to private title succession. She understood that this was not merely a gift, a retired archivist told Royal Insider. It was stewardship. She approached every decision with seriousness and foresight, understanding the weight of responsibility she was inheriting. The transfer itself was understated yet profoundly consequential. There were no press events, no public ceremonies, no conferral of new titles. A single line in the government land register marked the completion of the inheritance. On the evening of January 25th, Buckingham Palace issued a simple confirmation statement. Observers hailed it as a strategic masterstroke. The estate remained private, yet Louise now held authority over archives and artifacts inaccessible even to the monarch herself. She was no longer merely a quiet granddaughter. She was the custodian of a portion of royal memory. Louise's path was guided by 3 critical allies. First, Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, ensured staff payrolls remained under the Royal Heritage Trust, personally delivered the estate keys in a sealed envelope, and shut down Camilla's legal challenge with one decisive line: "You do not challenge the last wish of the sovereign, you honour it." Second, Duchess Sophie, Louise's mother, worked discreetly to prevent audits, block media leaks, and provide intelligence on surveillance attempts. Cybersecurity experts confirmed that in late 2025, multiple drone and camera-based attempts to monitor the northern tree line of the estate were neutralised by Sophie's planning. Third, and most unexpectedly, Prince Edward played a decisive role. In November 2025, Camilla requested that he delay the registration of the inheritance. Edward refused, delivering a line that resonated across the palace: "My daughter will not be a placeholder for your ambitions. You had your turn." With that, the final barrier fell. The inheritance was formalised, the deed transferred, and for the first time since Elizabeth II's passing, Queen Camilla found herself powerless. On a quiet January afternoon, Lady Louise Windsor walked through the gates of Greyfriars Church, a centuries-old chapel nestled in the misty Scottish Highlands, a short distance from the Grey House. There were no cameras snapping, no security detail marching, no royal entourage, no rigid protocols to follow. Yet even in this serene isolation, her presence commanded attention. Pinned delicately to her lapel was a brooch that had never been seen in public. Its subtle brilliance, an interlacing of silver thistle and Tudor roses, centred by a small diamond heart, was unmistakably Edwardian. Yet what made the piece remarkable was not only its beauty, it was the discreet engraving on its underside, a motto used only by Queen Elizabeth II in correspondence with Princess Anne, Prince Philip, and Lady Sarah Chatto. The message was clear: this was not simply jewellery, it was a signal, a statement. Lady Louise was stepping out of the shadows and answering the call of royal life, not for spectacle, not for fame, but for responsibility. After placing flowers on the altar and lighting a candle, she moved to the microphone. The expectation was for a typical charity announcement, yet what she delivered became the defining royal video of January 2026. "The house I inherited is not a trophy," she said, her voice calm yet resonant, carrying through the chapel's stone halls. "I do not claim it because of my name, but because of what I have learned from those who came before me. Quiet loyalty, private strength, faith that does not perform, but protects. I will not run from the inheritance of character, and I will not allow its memory to be rewritten for convenience." She then bowed, not to the cameras, not to the assembled press, but to a stone plaque behind the altar. It bore a line from Queen Elizabeth II's first Christmas broadcast. "It is not the crown that grants duty, it is duty that gives meaning to the crown." In that simple act, she acknowledged that her role was not one of visibility or grandeur, but of moral responsibility. Within hours, the palace issued a rare public statement, not from King Charles, but from Princess Anne herself, recognizing Lady Louise's voice as independent, strong, and morally grounded. Inside the palace, reactions were immediate and intense. King Charles reportedly cleared his calendar for the following 48 hours to hold a private meeting with Prince Edward at Balmoral's North Wing. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, was photographed entering Clarence House alone, visibly shaken. She had believed the family would close ranks in her favour, but instead they rallied around Louise. The tabloids erupted. Headlines read, "Windsor's silent flame ignites a new era," and "Louise's Grey House speech, a crownless coronation." Perhaps most unexpectedly, Princess Catherine made her presence known without issuing a statement. Instead, she posted a single Instagram photo of a handwritten note signed simply, "C." The note read, "Legacy is not what we receive, it is what we choose to preserve." Tagged #GRHouse and #WindsorDuty, the post went viral, collecting over 2 million likes within 20 minutes. Sources confirmed that Louise's speech prompted an emergency meeting of the Royal Continuity Office, tasked with overseeing succession, optics, and legacy alignment. The office feared that Louise's public emergence had created a shadow narrative beyond Camilla's influence, and in some ways, even overshadowed Prince William's formal role. Yet William reportedly remained unbothered, telling Catherine, "She's just doing what we were raised to do, and she's doing it better than some of us ever could." Camilla's response was swift, but ultimately ineffective. Within 72 hours, her office announced the Crown's Compassion, a life in modern royal service, scheduled to debut at St. George's Hall. The timing appeared intentional. Only 30 minutes after the Royal Collection Trust confirmed Louise's joint archival project with Princess Anne, titled The Quiet Years. St. George's Hall, one of Queen Elizabeth II's favourite ceremonial spaces, was steeped in tradition and symbolism. Camilla sought to reframe her role as indispensable, to remind the public that loyalty is not measured in silence. Yet, the exhibition opened to lukewarm reviews. Critics noted its lack of authenticity and emotional depth. Several exhibits focused heavily on photographs of Camilla, emphasizing her role beside the sovereign rather than showcasing meaningful service. Social media erupted, trending hashtags like #GreyHouseOverGlamour, while Catherine posted another story showing Louise, Anne, and 3 staffers sorting archival boxes, captioned, "Work, not display, duty, not decoration." Interactions soared past 3 million in under a day. Tensions escalated further on the evening of January 26th. Camilla confronted Princess Anne in what palace insiders described as a glass chandelier moment in the Long Gallery at Windsor Castle. Camilla accused Anne of orchestrating Louise's rise, manipulating a child to take the spotlight. Anne, calm and unwavering, replied, "If the spotlight finds her, Camilla, it is because the public sees what you're trying to hide." When Camilla argued that Louise had never been intended as a working royal, Anne's response stunned those nearby. "Neither were you, and yet here we are." Camilla left the room silently, leaving a silence so thick staff described it as funeral grade. Days later, Camilla's exhibition quietly closed. No farewell statement was issued. Instead, the royal family's official website unveiled a new banner, The Quiet Years, curated by Lady Louise and Princess Anne. A single quote from Queen Elizabeth II accompanied it. "What is remembered with dignity endures longer than what is displayed for applause." Louise's message had not only been heard, it had been absorbed by the institution itself. By early February, Lady Louise's name appeared in headlines normally reserved for senior royals. Universities invited her to speak on youth leadership, duty, and legacy. A BBC poll on February 5th showed 71% of Britons believed she should receive a formal title if she chose to serve publicly, rising to 84% near the Grey House. On February 7th, Buckingham Palace quietly confirmed King Charles III had extended a formal offer, full elevation to Her Royal Highness, Princess Louise, with duties including youth education, cultural heritage, and intergenerational leadership programs. The conditions were stringent. She would reside part-time in London, undergo a security evaluation, accept protective measures, and suspend private commercial endeavours, including equestrian coaching. The offer divided the royal household. Princess Anne offered cautious support. Sophie reportedly grew emotional, and some aides whispered concerns about the weight of the role. On February 8th, Meghan Markle made veiled remarks on a US talk show, widely interpreted as a critique of Louise. Social media erupted with #SilencePrincess. Princess Anne and Prince Edward responded with a rare joint statement. Lady Louise Windsor has neither asked for a throne nor a stage. She has only ever accepted responsibility when others discarded it. The statement was firm, yet understated, reinforcing Louise's quiet authority, and critics swiftly labelled Meghan's comments petty and tone-deaf. On February 10th, standing on the snow-dusted steps of the Grey House, Louise unveiled the Grey House Initiative, a living trust for duty designed to honour those who serve quietly, preserve heritage, and prepare young leaders. Streamed live, the announcement drew over 9 million viewers. When asked whether she would accept the HRH title, Louise paused, letting the moment breathe. Then, softly but resolutely, she said, "I am grateful for my family's trust, but duty does not require a title. For now, I remain simply Lady Louise." Days later, the palace confirmed that King Charles personally hand-delivered a letter to Louise, a tradition unused since Queen Elizabeth II wrote to Prince William before his investiture. The letter read, "Your grandmother believed that greatness grows in silence. I now see she was speaking of you." Louise's response reportedly moved Charles to tears. By mid-February, the monarchy had shifted subtly, yet profoundly. On one side, those seeking visibility leveraged titles to shape narratives. On the other, Lady Louise, without crown or HRH designation, commanded reverence through humility, courage, and moral clarity. She had inherited more than property. She had inherited ethical authority. She had endured attacks, remained unshaken, and chosen service over spectacle. Even without a formal title, she became known as the guardian of the Grey House. Her influence suggested a subtle transformation within the monarchy itself, proving that true power lies not in display, but in quiet, steadfast choice. And as we reflect on this remarkable story, it's impossible not to be inspired. Lady Louise reminds us that greatness often grows in silence, that legacy is shaped by choices, and that service, courage, and integrity are the true markers of royalty. If her story has resonated with you, don't just move on. Pause, like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you can follow every chapter of this unfolding royal saga. Because when courage meets quiet strength, the world is watching and learning what real leadership looks like.